She walked with sneakers squeaking out her presence on the polished hardwood towards the principal's office, where the rules of high school dictated she acquire a note to explain her absence. Her right toe poked through her green cotton school socks. Everything felt askew. She'd never been to school this disheveled, but like a lot of things that had mattered before, she had ceased to care about her appearance. The sixth period bell rang as she neared the principal's office. The hallway succumbed to bodies in plaid and green and white, suffocating with chatter and screams. The sea of uniforms shocked her as she minnowed her way towards the office, forcing her shoulder blades to kiss in an approximation of confidence. Eat or be eaten. Hello listeners, I'm Travis West, and this is the CanLit Review Podcast, a book review podcast with a focus on Canadian authors. This podcast comes to you from Dartmouth, Nova Scotia on the east coast of Canada this 8th day of February 2018. Every 2 weeks or so, I'll be taking an in-depth look at a different Canadian novel. There's no particular criteria for which books I'll be talking about besides being Canadian, though to start off we'll be mostly looking at the long lists for the Giller Prize from the past few years. If you have any suggestions for books to be reviewed on the CanLit Review Podcast, be sure and send them in. This podcast will be available on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play, and likely just about anywhere else you can go to listen to podcasts. You can also listen to the CanLit Review Podcast here on the official website, canlitpodcast.com, where you can subscribe, listen to past episodes, and send in suggestions for books to review in the future. I will, in my reviews, try very hard to avoid revealing any unnecessary plot points or spoilers, as my intent is to convince you, the listeners, to seek out these books and read them for yourself. But of course, as these will be fairly in-depth reviews, some discussion of the plot is necessary, so please be aware of the potential for some minor spoilers. Today we're going to be looking at The Best Kind of People by Zoe Whittle. Published in 2016, The Best Kind of People was shortlisted for the Scotiabank Giller Prize and was on the top 100 books of the year lists for the National Post and the Globe and Mail, as well as being named Indigo's Best Book of 2016. George Woodbury is a high school teacher, and he is beloved by his family, his students, and most of the town of Avalon Hills. Everyone knows and respects George, and his family has been an institution in the town for generations. George wins Teacher of the Year every single year. George is a hero. But George is, seemingly out of nowhere, arrested and charged with several counts of sexual impropriety and the attempted rape of one of his students. George's family is ripped apart by the allegations, as is the entire town of Avalon Hills. The book mainly follows the members of George's family as they attempt to reconcile the father and husband they thought they knew with the man he could secretly have been all along. The Best Kind of People is also a difficult, painful, and in-depth examination of the current rape culture epidemic, but it's about more than that too. When there are crimes of this nature, there are the obvious victims, and those are the stories we're usually told, in gruesome, excruciating detail on the evening news. But there are others who suffer as well. Imagine being married to the person accused of such a crime. Imagine it being your father. Everyone who loves someone charged with crimes of this nature is simultaneously a victim and a target for the public, the media, even their own family and friends. The world often looks only at the direct victims of the assault as needing our empathy, but in actuality, everyone who loves George becomes a victim. The people of Avalon Hills are split, with George's many staunch defenders proclaiming his absolute innocence, proven by their personal experiences with the man and knowledge of his character. Although George's innocence is without question to his supporters, many of them assert that even if, hypothetically, George had done the things he is accused of, the fault would still lie elsewhere, specifically with George's young accusers whose promiscuity is as assured as George's innocence. Despite being a small town, Avalon Hills has a surprisingly robust group of men's rights advocates who seek to defend the put-upon men of the world from the increasingly malicious attacks of feminism. The other half of the town believes the accusers and immediately decries George as a monster, despite his long-standing history of being a good guy. Caught in the middle of these two opposing factions are George's family, who don't know what to believe. Sadie is George's daughter, and despite her initial reluctance to even consider the possibility of George's guilt, she finds herself unable to shake off the doubts she has about the kind of man her father is, even though he's never shown any sort of impropriety in front of her. Sadie's point of view is erratic and confused, wavering from almost absolute certainty in one direction to the complete opposite in an instant. As a student at the school where George taught, and where his accusers continue to attend, you can imagine how painful attending classes would be for her. She is reviled by some as the daughter of a demon, and the people that show her support are the people she would never have associated with before the arrest, groups like the MRAs. Sadie wants to believe her father, but she wants to believe the victims as well, and her torment and indecision is one of the emotional pillars of the book. Similarly conflicted is Joan, George's wife. With half the town against her, as though she was in some way responsible for George's alleged actions, even those who continue to support her do so because they believe she is innocent, not because they believe George is, especially Joan's sister, who was utterly convinced of George's guilt from the start. Joan has to grapple not only with the possibility that George is guilty, but also with the reality that even if he is guilty, she still loves him. Out of all the members of George's family, his son Andrew is the most certain of his father's innocence. Andrew, somewhat older than Sadie, grew up gay in Avalon Hills and has some idea how dark high school life can be. Maybe his disbelief of the accusers stems from his own experiences with how cruel high school students were to him when he attended. Further complicating Andrew's perspective is the fact that he was himself involved in a statutory rape scenario with a member of the faculty when he attended Avalon Hills Prep School, though he maintains that in his situation, no one did anything wrong. Coming around to the possibility that his father might not be the man Andrew thought he was, and realizing that his own experiences with an older man might not have been as benign as he thought, make Andrew's time back in Avalon Hills a confusing and eye-opening experience for him. Other, smaller characters include Jimmy, Sadie's boyfriend, whose limited understanding of women and of sex make him unreliable as a support mechanism for her, as she grapples with her own sexual awakening in the shadow of her father's horrific accusations. And there's also Kevin, a local author and Jimmy's almost stepdad, who seeks to exploit the Woodbury family's situation for his own gain, uncaring how the Woodburys will be adversely affected. The book itself is simply and cleverly written, descriptive but usually unflowery. Though written in third person, each section takes root deep in the psyche of the character who is being featured, and explores their conflict as honestly and thoroughly as if it was written in their own voice. Time passes irregularly between chapters, with some days and weeks being examined with careful hour-by-hour scrutiny, while at other times months pass by with barely a passing comment. Although at first this can make the narrative feel disjointed, as there is no stability to the way that time passes for characters in the novel, it ultimately feels reflective of how this sort of trauma plays out in real life, with certain events crashing down on us with great importance and effect, while the time between those events can seem to disappear, day-to-day events taking over with rhythm and routine, the trauma locked in a sort of holding pattern as everyone waits for new developments. Whittle is frank and honest about the sexual interactions between her characters, even the underage ones, but the details here are important to understanding what these characters, especially Sadie, are trying to work through in their own minds. There's nothing titillating or voyeuristic about the sex here, it's just a part of the story that needs to be examined along with everything else. After all, sex and control are the key components driving the rape culture that fuels the defense of George by so many of the residents in Avalon Hills. Avalon Hills, for its part, feels reflective of potentially many small towns in Canada or the US. There's all kinds of people there, but for the most part they keep their opinions to themselves, at least until provoked. Like so many places undergoing a similar transmutation in the face of recent revelations of sexual assault, the accusation of a man who is liked and admired turns out to be the catalyst and the provocation needed to bring out the best and worst in some people. It's worth noting that it is not only men who are behind George Woodbury, but many women as well, whether because they still believe him to be a good guy, or because they align themselves with the views of the MRAs that it's the promiscuous teens who are responsible for any wrongdoing. Whether the teens are guilty of fabricating the stories, or whether they're guilty of cruelly seducing the virtuous George Woodbury, doesn't seem to matter to most George supporters, so long as George is vindicated one way or another. George is both central to everything going on in the book, but at the same time unimportant. Whittle never really dives into George's psyche the way she does the members of his family, and for most of the book, and indeed perhaps even after its conclusion, many of his deeds and motivations remain nebulous. But even if we never come to truly understand George, every character exists, to most of the town, as an extension of him. Sadie is George's daughter. Joan is George's wife. Andrew is George's son. Everyone in town sees the Woodburys only in the context of their relationship to the man accused of the sex crimes, their own identities being lost or ignored to everyone looking in on the situation from the outside. What Whittle does with the best kind of people is give them back their voice. Sadie is Sadie. Joan is Joan. Andrew is Andrew. They exist outside of the George Woodbury microcosm, and their struggles deserve to be understood and documented. These are people who have done nothing wrong and are being torn in every direction and assaulted from all sides. It isn't Sadie's fault her father was accused of doing these terrible things, but neither is it her fault that she still loves him. You don't simply stop loving someone because they are accused of a crime, and even if they're guilty, your feelings for them are not going to vanish overnight. This is a novel about those complex relationships and about the people who are locked in this endless tug-of-war with their own emotions. In a situation like this, we often consider the victims of the assault to be the quote-unquote true victims, but the best kind of people challenges the notion of true victims. It presents the case that we don't need to judge one victim against another, to rate the depth of their victimization, to consider anyone more a victim than anyone else. Instead, it proposes that we look at all the victims of a crime like this as individuals, each coping with their own pain and confusion. When an assault like this happens, we need to look at everyone involved and support all the victims, regardless of their relationship with the accused. We need to look out for all the people who are hurt by these crimes, not just the obvious ones. Ultimately, the novel shows us many points of view and provides ample context to formulate our own opinions. But if you are looking for some sort of catharsis or easy answers, this book will not provide them. There are no easy answers to these situations in real life, and the book doesn't gloss over that cruel ambiguity. This is an unflinching look at the true hardship and pain of loving someone accused of a horrible crime. There's no simple resolution here, and you can expect the ending to hit you like a punch in the stomach that will likely resonate with you for a long time after you put the book down. Well, those are my thoughts on Zoe Whittle's The Best Kind of People. I hope you enjoyed listening, and I hope, if you haven't read this amazing book, that I have inspired you to seek it out and read it for yourself. Before I go, just a reminder, you can find the CanLit Review podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, SoundCloud, and here at canlitpodcast.com. You can find me on Twitter at Travis Reads, Instagram at Travis West, or on YouTube at Travis Reads Books.